Welcome, friends, to a heartwarming tale of unexpected love that proves it's never too late to rewrite your own happily ever after. Enjoy the story. Grace Thompson hurried around her friend Susan's cramped apartment, gathering her belongings and preparing to leave. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the dusty windows, highlighting the worry lines etched on Grace's face. "I swear, Grace, I don't know how you do it," Susan said, shaking her head as she watched her friend slip on her worn coat. "Day in, day out, rushing off to take care of that old woman. She's not even your real mother-in-law anymore. For crying out loud." Grace paused, her hand on the doorknob. She turned to face Susan, a familiar mixture of exasperation and determination in her eyes. "Martha needs me, Sue. She doesn't have anyone else." "And what about you?" Susan pressed, her voice rising. "You're 40 years old, Grace. You should be out there living your life, not playing nurse to some old lady who just happens to be the mother of your dead husband." The words hung in the air between them, harsh and unforgiving. Grace flinched as if she'd been slapped, but quickly composed herself. When she spoke, her voice was soft but firm. "Martha is a kind and decent woman who's been through hell. Ryan may be gone, but that doesn't change the fact that she was there for me when I had no one else. I won't abandon her now just because things are tough." Susan threw up her hands in defeat. "Fine, fine. Martyr yourself if you must, just don't come crying to me when you wake up one day and realize you've wasted your life." Grace managed a small smile. "I appreciate your concern, Sue. I really do. But trust me, I'm exactly where I need to be." With that, she stepped out into the chilly evening air, leaving Susan staring after her with a mixture of frustration and grudging admiration. As Grace made her way down the street, her mind wandered to the day 3 years ago when everything had changed. The memory of the police officers at her door, their faces grim as they delivered the news of Ryan's car accident, still had the power to take her breath away. And then, just when she thought things couldn't get worse, Martha had suffered a devastating stroke at Ryan's funeral. In the blink of an eye, Grace had gone from happily married graphic designer to widow and full-time caregiver. It wasn't the life she had planned, but as she quickened her pace, eager to get home to Martha, she knew in her heart that she was doing the right thing. The street lamps flickered to life as Grace rounded the corner, casting a warm glow on the sidewalk. She paused for a moment, taking in the sight of families through lit windows, going about their evening routines. A pang of longing shot through her, but she quickly pushed it aside. She had made her choice, and she would see it through. With renewed determination, Grace set off towards home, unaware that fate was about to throw her the curveball of a lifetime. The biting wind whipped at Grace's face as she hurried down Main Street, pulling her threadbare coat tighter around her. She glanced at her watch and quickened her pace. Martha would be waiting for her, probably worrying if Grace was even a minute late. As she approached Johnson's pharmacy, Grace saw a familiar face through the window. Betty, the kindly pharmacist who had been filling Martha's prescriptions for years, waved her inside. Grace hesitated for a moment. She really should get home, but the promise of a few minutes of warmth won out. The bell above the door jingled as Grace entered, enveloped immediately by the comforting smell of medicine and peppermints. "Grace, honey," Betty called out, her round face creased with a warm smile. "I was hoping you'd stop by. Martha's refills came in this morning." Grace made her way to the counter, fishing in her purse for her wallet. "Thanks, Betty. You're a lifesaver, as always." As Betty rang up the medications, she studied Grace's tired face. "How are you holding up, dear? You look like you could use a good night's sleep." Grace managed a weak smile. "Oh, you know how it is. Martha had a rough night, so neither of us got much rest. But we're managing." Betty shook her head, her eyes filled with admiration. "I don't know how you do it, Grace. Most people would have thrown in the towel long ago. But here you are, still taking care of Martha after everything that's happened." Grace felt a lump form in her throat. "She's family, Betty. Maybe not by blood, but in all the ways that matter. I couldn't abandon her." As she handed over the bag of prescriptions, Betty reached out and squeezed Grace's hand. "You're a good soul, Grace Thompson. Don't you ever forget that." Blinking back tears, Grace nodded her thanks and hurried out of the pharmacy. As she walked, her mind drifted back to happier times, Lazy Sunday mornings with Ryan, family dinners with Martha and her late husband, dreams of the future that now seemed impossibly distant. She remembered the day Ryan had introduced her to his parents, how nervous she'd been. But Martha had welcomed her with open arms, treating Grace like the daughter she'd never had. Even after Ryan's father passed away, the bond between Grace and Martha had only grown stronger. The memory of Ryan's funeral flashed unbidden through Grace's mind. The shock of the accident, the numbness that had enveloped her as she stood by the graveside. And then Martha's collapse, the panic as ambulances were called, the long nights in the hospital praying for a miracle. Grace shook her head, trying to dispel the painful memories. She focused instead on the present, on the small victories that made up her days now. Martha's first steps after months of physical therapy, the joy in her eyes when she managed to feed herself again, the quiet evenings they spent together, finding comfort in each other's presence. As she turned onto her street, Grace felt a renewed sense of purpose. Yes, her life had taken an unexpected turn, but she was doing something that mattered. She was making a difference, one day at a time. Little did she know, as she approached her modest home, that her world was about to be turned upside down once again. For there, parked in front of her house, was a sleek black car that screamed money and power, a stark contrast to the working-class neighborhood. Grace's heart began to race. Who could it be? Bill collectors? Lawyers? Some remnant from Ryan's troubled past come back to haunt them? Taking a deep breath, she steeled herself for whatever awaited her behind that front door. One thing was certain. Whoever it was, they'd have to go through Grace Thompson if they wanted to get to Martha. With determination in her step, Grace marched up to her front door, ready to face whatever challenge lay ahead. Grace's hand trembled slightly as she turned the key in the lock. The sound of muffled voices from inside did nothing to calm her nerves. Taking a deep breath, she pushed open the door and stepped into the small living room. The scene that greeted her was so unexpected, so out of place in their humble home, that for a moment Grace thought she must be dreaming. Martha, looking more animated than Grace had seen her in years, sat in her favorite armchair. Her silver hair was neatly combed, and there was a flush of excitement on her cheeks. But it was the man sitting across from her that made Grace's jaw drop. He was elderly, probably in his mid-70s, but carried himself with the bearing of someone much younger. His tailored suit and perfectly coiffed silver hair spoke of wealth and refinement. As Grace entered, both Martha and the stranger turned to look at her. "Grace!" Martha exclaimed, her voice filled with an enthusiasm Grace hadn't heard in ages. "You're finally home. Come meet Frank." Grace approached cautiously, her eyes darting between Martha and the mysterious visitor. "Hello," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Grace Thompson." The man, Frank, stood smoothly, taking her hand in a firm grip. "Frank Holloway," he said, his voice deep and cultured. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Grace. Martha has told me so much about you." Grace's mind was reeling. Who was this man? How did he know Martha? And why did the name Holloway sound vaguely familiar? As if reading her thoughts, Martha spoke up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Oh, Grace," she said softly, "you won't believe it. It's Frank, my Frank, after all these years." Suddenly it clicked. Grace remembered a conversation from years ago, a rare moment when Martha had opened up about her past. Frank Holloway, the man she had loved and lost in her youth, the man whose memory had haunted her all these years. "Please sit down," Frank said, gesturing to the worn sofa. "I'm sure you have questions. I know I did when I first tracked Martha down." Grace sank onto the couch, her legs suddenly feeling weak. I don't understand," she stammered. "How did you find each other after all this time?" Frank and Martha exchanged a look filled with years of unspoken emotion. "It's a long story," Frank began, "one that starts with a misunderstanding and ends with a second chance neither of us ever thought we'd get." As Frank began to recount the tale of their long-ago separation and recent reunion, Grace found herself drawn into a story of love, loss, and the twists of fate that can change a life in an instant. She watched as Martha's eyes lit up, years seeming to fall away as she relived the joy of her youth, and despite her initial shock and confusion, Grace felt a warmth spreading through her chest. It had been so long since she'd seen Martha truly happy. But as the story unfolded, a nagging thought began to form in the back of Grace's mind. If Martha reunited with her long-lost love, where did that leave Grace? The life she had built around caring for Martha suddenly seemed precarious, balanced on the edge of a change she hadn't seen coming. As the evening wore on and Frank prepared to leave, promising to return the next day, Grace found herself grappling with a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite name. Joy for Martha, certainly, but also fear, uncertainty, and a tiny, unexpected spark of hope. Little did she know this was just the beginning of a journey that would challenge everything she thought she knew about love, family, and the power of second chances. The next few days passed in a whirlwind of activity. Frank was a constant presence, arriving each morning with fresh pastries and a sparkle in his eye that made Martha blush like a schoolgirl. Grace watched their rekindled romance with a mixture of joy and wistfulness, happy for Martha, but acutely aware of her own loneliness. It was on the fourth day of Frank's visits that everything changed once again. Grace was in the kitchen preparing lunch when she heard the unmistakable sound of a car pulling up outside. Wiping her hands on a dish towel, she made her way to the front door, expecting to see Frank's now familiar black sedan. Instead, she found herself face to face with a man who took her breath away. He was tall, probably in his early 40s, with salt and pepper hair and eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. And oh, what a smile it was, warm and genuine, lighting up his entire face. "Hi there," he said, his voice a rich baritone that sent an unexpected shiver down Grace's spine. "I'm Ethan Holloway, Frank's son. Is he here?" Grace stood frozen for a moment, her mind struggling to process this new development. Frank had mentioned having children, but somehow she hadn't expected this. Yes, he's inside with Martha," she finally managed, stepping back to allow Ethan entry. "I'm Grace Thompson." Ethan's smile widened as he stepped into the house. "Ah, the famous Grace. Dad's told me all about you. Says you're some kind of saint for taking care of Martha all these years." Grace felt a blush creeping up her cheeks. "I'm no saint," she protested. She's family, you know?" Something in Ethan's expression softened. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think I do know." As they made their way to the living room, Grace couldn't help but steal glances at Ethan. There was something about him, a quiet strength, a kindness in his eyes, that drew her in despite her best efforts to maintain emotional distance. Frank's face lit up when he saw his son. "Ethan, I didn't expect you until tomorrow." Ethan shrugged, a boyish grin playing on his lips. "Finished up my work early. Thought I'd surprise you." As father and son embraced, Grace caught Martha's eye. The older woman was watching her with a knowing look, a small smile playing on her lips. Grace quickly averted her gaze, suddenly feeling like a teenager with a crush. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of conversation and laughter. Ethan regaled them with stories of his work as an environmental lawyer, his passion for the cause evident in every word. Grace found herself drawn into the discussion, surprised at how easy it was to talk to this man she had just met. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow through the windows, Ethan stood to leave. "I should get going," he said, a note of reluctance in his voice. "But I'd love to hear more about your work with the local animal shelter, Grace. Maybe over coffee sometime?" Grace felt her heart skip a beat. Was he asking her out? After all this time, the idea seemed almost foreign. But looking into Ethan's hopeful eyes, she found herself nodding. "I'd like that," she said softly. As she watched Ethan drive away, Grace was hit with a sudden realization. For the first time in years, she was looking forward to something beyond her daily routine of caring for Martha. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. "He seems like a nice young man." Martha's voice startled Grace out of her reverie. Grace turned to find Martha watching her with a knowing smile. "Oh, yes, he does," Grace stammered, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. Martha reached out and patted Grace's hand. "It's okay to be happy, dear, to want something for yourself." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. "I don't know if I remember how," she whispered. Martha's grip on her hand tightened. "Then it's high time you learned again, don't you think?" As Grace helped Martha to bed that night, Her mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Excitement at the prospect of getting to know Ethan better, warred with guilt over even considering a life beyond her role as Martha's caregiver. And underlying it all was a deep-seated fear of opening her heart again, of risking the pain of loss that had nearly broken her when Ryan died. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, Grace couldn't help but feel a tiny spark of hope flickering to life in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, life had more in store for her than she dared to dream. The next few weeks passed in a blur of stolen moments and shared smiles. True to his word, Ethan called Grace the very next day to set up their coffee date. What was meant to be a quick chat over lattes turned into hours of conversation, laughter, and a connection that left Grace feeling more alive than she had in years. Their relationship grew slowly but steadily. Ethan, understanding Grace's commitments to Martha, never pushed for more than she could give. He became a regular fixture at the house, often dropping by with takeout dinners or offering to sit with Martha so Grace could have a few hours to herself. One particularly memorable evening, Grace returned from a much-needed trip to the salon to find Ethan and Martha engaged in an intense game of chess, both of them laughing uproariously at some shared joke. "You're back!" Ethan exclaimed, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "We were just... Wow! Grace, you look amazing!" Grace felt a blush creep up her cheeks. It had been so long since anyone had looked at her that way, with such open admiration and affection. "Thank you," she murmured, suddenly feeling shy. Martha, watching the exchange with twinkling eyes, declared herself tired and insisted on turning in early, leaving Grace and Ethan alone. As they sat on the porch swing, watching the stars come out, Ethan took Grace's hand in his. "I hope you know how special you are, Grace," he said softly. "The way you've dedicated yourself to Martha, the kindness and strength you show every day. It's incredible." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes. "I'm just doing what anyone would do," she protested weakly. Ethan shook his head. "No, you're not. You're doing what only someone with an incredibly big heart would do, and I'm falling in love with that heart." The words hung in the air between them, full of promise and possibility. Grace felt her breath catch in her throat. "Ethan, But before she could finish, Ethan leaned in and kissed her, soft and sweet and full of emotion. In that moment, all of Grace's fears and doubts melted away. She knew, with a certainty that shook her to her core, that she was falling in love too. As their relationship deepened, however, not everyone was as supportive as Martha. Grace's coworkers, particularly her friend Susan, reacted with a mixture of disbelief and thinly veiled jealousy when Ethan began sending elaborate flower arrangements to the office. "I don't get it," Susan muttered one day, eyeing the latest bouquet of roses with suspicion. "What does a guy like that see in someone like you? No offense, Grace, but you're not exactly in his league." The words stung, but Grace refused to let them dampen her happiness. "Maybe he sees something in me that I'd forgotten was there," she replied quietly, turning back to her work. But despite her outward confidence, Grace couldn't help but wonder if Susan had a point. Was she fooling herself, thinking she could have a future with someone like Ethan? Could she really balance her commitment to Martha with a new relationship? As the days turned to weeks, and weeks to months, Grace found herself at a crossroads. Her feelings for Ethan were deepening, but so too was her fear of the changes a serious relationship would bring. Something would have to give, and soon. Little did Grace know, fate was about to force her hand in the most unexpected of ways. The office was a flurry of activity, tension hanging thick in the air, as Grace and her co-workers raced to finish their year-end reports. Their boss, Mr. Jameson, had made it clear that no one would be leaving for the New Year's holiday until every last spreadsheet was perfect. Grace's eyes burned from staring at her computer screen, her back aching from hours hunched over her desk. She glanced at the clock 6:30 p.m. on New Year's Eve. With a sigh, she turned back to her work, determined to power through. Suddenly, a commotion at the front of the office caught her attention. Grace looked up to see Ethan striding through the door, a massive bouquet of white roses in his arms and a determined look on his face. "Ethan!" Grace gasped, rising from her chair. What are you doing here? Ethan's eyes found hers across the room, his face breaking into a warm smile. Rescuing you, he said simply, approaching her desk. It's New Year's Eve, Grace. You shouldn't be stuck in this office. Grace felt her cheeks burn as she became acutely aware of her co-worker's stares. I can't just leave, she protested weakly. We have to finish these reports. Actually, Mr. Jameson's voice cut through the tension. I think we can call it a night. Good work, everyone. See you next year. A cheer went up from the staff as people began shutting down computers and gathering their things. Grace stood frozen, torn between responsibility and the allure of Ethan's surprise. Susan appeared at her elbow, her voice low and tinged with envy. Go, you idiot, she hissed, before he comes to his senses and realizes he could do better. The words stung, but they also spurred Grace into action. With shaking hands, she gathered her coat and purse. Okay, she said softly, looking up at Ethan. Let's go. As they left the office, Ethan's hand warm and steady on the small of her back, Grace felt a surge of emotion. This man, this wonderful, kind man, had chosen her. Despite her baggage, despite her commitments, he wanted to be with her. In the elevator, Ethan turned to her, his eyes serious. Grace, there's something I need to tell you. Grace's heart leapt into her throat. Was this it? The moment when he realized Susan was right, that he could do better? But Ethan's next words banished all her fears. I love you, Grace Thompson. I love your kindness, your strength, your huge heart. And I want to spend the rest of my life showing you just how amazing you are. Tears sprang to Grace's eyes as Ethan dropped to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Will you marry me, Grace? Will you let me be part of the beautiful life you've built, with Martha and with your incredible capacity for love? For a moment, Grace couldn't speak. All the doubts and fears that had plagued her these past months seemed to melt away in the face of Ethan's love and certainty. Yes, she whispered, her voice growing stronger with each word. Yes, Ethan, I love you too. I want to build a life with you. As Ethan slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a passionate kiss, Grace felt as though her heart might burst with joy. For the first time in years, she was looking forward to the future with hope and excitement. But as they drove home to share the news with Martha and Frank, a small voice in the back of Grace's mind whispered a question she couldn't quite silence. How would this change affect the life she'd built with Martha? Could she really have it all? Love, family, and the commitment she'd made to her former mother-in-law? Little did Grace know, the answer to that question would come sooner than she ever could have imagined. The early morning sun painted the highway in shades of gold. As Grace gazed out the car window, her mind whirling with the events of the past few weeks. In the driver's seat, Ethan hummed softly along with the radio, his free hand resting comfortably on Grace's knee. In the back seat, Martha and Frank dozed, their hands intertwined even in sleep. It had all happened so fast. After the joy of Grace and Ethan's engagement announcement, Frank had dropped a bombshell of his own. He wanted Martha to move back to his hometown with him, to the life and love they'd been denied all those years ago. Grace's initial panic at the thought of being separated from Martha had been quickly soothed by Ethan's suggestion. Why not all move together? Start fresh in a new place, building a life that combined all the love and family they'd found. Now, as they drove towards their new home and new life, Grace felt a mix of excitement and nostalgia wash over her. She thought of the little house they'd left behind, the one where she'd nursed Martha back to health, where she'd fallen in love with Ethan. But as she looked at the man beside her, at the family they were building together, she knew that home wasn't a place. It was the people you loved. Penny, for your thoughts? Ethan asked softly, glancing over at her with a warm smile. Grace squeezed his hand. Just thinking about how much has changed, how much I've changed. A year ago, I never would have imagined this. Ethan nodded, understanding in his eyes. Life has a funny way of surprising us, doesn't it? But I think sometimes those surprises turn out to be exactly what we need. As if on cue, Martha stirred in the back seat. Are we there yet? She asked, her voice thick with sleep but tinged with excitement. Grace turned to smile at her. Almost, Martha. how are you feeling?" Martha's eyes twinkled as she looked between Grace and Frank. "Like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, dear, with the family I was always meant to have." Tears pricked at Grace's eyes as the full weight of Martha's words hit her. Family. That's what they were now. A beautifully blended, unconventional family bound together by love and second chances. As they pulled into the driveway of their new home, Grace felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead might not always be smooth, but with Ethan by her side and Martha and Frank nearby, she knew they could face whatever challenges came their way. Ethan came around to open her door, extending his hand with a flourish. "Ready for our new adventure, Mrs. Soon-to-be Holloway?" Grace took his hand, her heart full to bursting. "More than ready, Mr. Holloway. Let's build our happily ever after." As they helped Martha and Frank from the car and made their way to the front door, Grace caught sight of their reflection in the window. 4 people, different ages and backgrounds, united by love and the belief that it's never too late for a second chance at happiness. And in that moment, Grace knew with absolute certainty that the best was yet to come.